Coming. It's such a pleasure to look at this room and realize how many people are so excited to be here to listen to our wonderful speaker today. My name is Antonio Merlot. I am the Dean of the School of Social Sciences here at Rice, and I'm also the Director of the Rice Initiative for the Study of Economics. And this is our fourth Rice lecture. And the Rice lecture was created in the fall of 2015 as an opportunity for bringing Nobel Laureate in economics here on campus and have the opportunities for the Rice community to interact with them and learn from their wisdom. The lecture series was created and it's actually made possible by a generous gift from Rice economic alumnus and trustee Doyle Arnold, and we're very lucky to have Doyle with us tonight. So thank you, Doyle. It's a great honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Nobel Laureate Mike Spence, who's the William Berkeley Professor of Economics and Business at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's the Philip Knight Professor Emeritus of Management in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. Let me also add that currently, among all the beautiful things that Mike does, he's also teaching at my alma mater, Bocconi University in Milan, so I'm especially grateful. And in fact, he hopped on a flight from Milan to be here with us and give this lecture. Professor Spence's scholarship focuses on economic policy in emerging markets, focusing on the economics of information and the impact of leadership on economic growth. Between 2006 and 2010, he was chairman of the Independent Commission on Growth and Development, a global policy group focused on strategy for producing rapid and sustainable economic growth and reducing poverty. He's a Rhodes Scholar, an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an elected fellow of the Econometric Society, and is the recipient of many honors and awards. Professor Spence was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal in 1981, which is the award given by the American Economic Association to the best economist under the age of 40. And then in 2001, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Prior to moving to NYU, Professor Spence was at Stanford Business School, where he was both a professor and then became dean. And before that, he was a professor of economics and business administration at Harvard, where he was also the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. His PhD is also from Harvard. And that's when he was a PhD student at Harvard, he met a very special person, a vibrant, energetic, amazing development economist by the name of Malcolm Gillis. And the reason why Mike is here today is because Malcolm, before passing, actually came to me and said, we have the Rice lecture, we're inviting Nobel laureates on campus. We absolutely must invite Mike. And so it's especially a privilege to have him here today and also give us a chance not only of listening to what he has to say about these wonderful topics he's going to talk about, but also have a chance of remembering with his visit Malcolm Gillis, who did so much for this university. And without further ado, let me introduce Mike Spence.
Thank you, Antonio, President LeBron, Dean Merlot, Elizabeth. Thank you for a lovely dinner last night and being such a good friend. I'm thrilled to be here, but I feel like I've been surrounded by Rice people most of my life. At Stanford, as you probably know, and in Silicon Valley, there's a fairly important collection of Rice alums. Some are very good friends of mine, like Bert and Dee Dee McMurtry. And so Antonio's right. I reconnected with Malcolm, who's somebody I've admired all my life. We were young economists at Harvard, and he was a very important member of the Harvard Institute of International Development, and he was teaching and making a very big difference in a wide range of countries at the time. And then I went off to Stanford. He went off to Indonesia. I came back and became a dean of arts and sciences. He went to Duke and became a dean of arts and sciences. And then he became the president of Rice University, and I was shuffled off to Stanford as the dean of the business school. and then I wrote a book based on the work in the developing countries, where I've spent the last more than 10 years of my life. And I got this lovely note from Malcolm saying, I'm back to teaching. I've stepped down as president. I loved your book. I'm going to use it in my courses and seminars, and I was just thrilled. And so that we kind of got back together at that point. And when I got a note from him asking me if I'd come and speak with you today, I thought that's a lovely idea. I had a kind of complicated schedule. And by the time I answered him, he'd passed away. And so one of the saddest things for me about all of that is that I thought, we could grow old together talking about development economics and things where his experience was so deep and broad. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I take it as something that I would like to do in honor of Malcolm. This is the note Malcolm wrote to me. And I think it says, in terms of his work in development, let alone leading institutions and creating universities in developing countries, that's an awful lot of development work. And when he was doing it as a young economist, there weren't that many people interested in the developing world. It was small, it was poor, it had no systemic effects on the world that we live in here. And that, of course, has changed. So I thought about talking about development, and I realized most of you don't have 2 days to spend on this subject. So what I learned from this work in development is to think about growth patterns, the ones that work, the ones that don't, why they don't, how economies grow, how they generate employment. And I think we face some challenges. So what I'm going to talk about today are what these growth patterns look like mostly in developed countries, including our own here. And suggest that these challenges need a response. This is the book that I wrote that Malcolm responded to. The story is pretty simple. For 200 years, coming up to the end of World War II, starting with the British Industrial Revolution, 15% of the world's population experienced real growth for the first time, and the other 85% didn't. And the story and then America intervened in the lead and created an architecture that, in conjunction with the collapse of colonial empires, created the opportunity for growth among these other 85%. And we're well into a century in which they are starting to benefit from the kinds of things that have made our lives full of opportunity, not without challenge, but full of opportunity that until recently they never experienced. I still think this is the major story of our time in human terms. This is my favorite graph of all time. It's Bob Fogel's graph of the population of the world. It's probably hard for you to see, but I'll leave these behind. And what you can see that starting around 1750, there was a pretty major inflection point in the world's economy. And we started to grow. Again, with this lag, a period, 200 years of divergence and 100 years of what I called convergence. The world we live in now, and this it causes me, or as I'm in transition now to the growth patterns that we experience in developing countries. But if you go back even to the year 2000, the developing countries, which are the light part of these circles, or not 50%, maybe 40%. If you go back before that to the early post-war period, they're 20% of the global economy with 85% of the people. Kind of tells you a little bit about the relative differences in incomes and wealth. By the year 2010, they basically got to the 50% level, or almost. And I would say by now they're well over 50%. So we are living in a world in which the emerging economies are more than half the global economy. And they do increasingly have systemic important effects on us as well as the reverse we do on them. And of course, the big story has been China. I think slightly less readily obvious is Asia. Asia is is in process of becoming the dominant part of the global economy. The two future economic giants are China and India, assuming there's nothing major disruptive in their growth patterns. So what I want to talk about is trends that have occurred in the developed economies that you may or may not be aware of, but I want to show you what they look like and why they have created some challenges for us. So when I use the word growth patterns, I don't want you to just think of growth. If you're a business person, think of a bunch of KPIs that describe the growth patterns, the structural characteristics, the distributional characteristics, whose incomes are going up, whose incomes are stagnating, the sustainability characteristics, are we building debt to a point that we can't generate any more demand in that way? Are we letting our intangible or tangible assets on which all economies are based run down, etc.? So whatever that list is for you, think of it that way. Now you'll see a bit of it from me, but when I say the word growth, I want you to think growth pattern and something a little bit more elaborate than a number that tells you how much the economy grew. And the year 2000 is interesting to me because in every time series of data that describes some aspect of the growth patterns we're in that I look at, there's a kind of inflection point around there. And when, in the benefit of hindsight, it's not surprising. So these are the things that occurred in the neighborhood of the year 2000. We had a huge financial crisis in Asia in 97, 98, and a tremendous amount of change and adjustment in the way developing countries grew and their resilience. The euro was introduced, and at the end of my talk, if there's time, I'll tell you a little bit about the challenges we face in Europe. And if I get it wrong, Antonio will fix it fairly shortly thereafter. China entered the WTO, and the global markets were completely opened up to China and vice versa, almost. And finally, the much hyped internet, including the internet bubble, actually took off. And I don't have time, and you don't need me to take the time to explain in multiple dimensions, but the internet, which had all that promise that smart young people thought was there in 2001, but which was going to take a decade and a half to realize, started to be realized. So we have global supply chains that are sort of unbelievably complex, built on information technology platforms that just wasn't possible before. So if you look at an Apple supply chain, it's designed in the United States, it's assembled in China, the semiconductors and displays come from South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, and all this thing comes together and it actually works. It's not wildly inefficient, and then it gets sold, marketed, more value added's created, and so on. All of that has occurred in the last 15 years. So now I'm going to show you what the things that strike me. And I want you to think of these as lenses for looking at an economy, different aspects of the way it's growing, and so on. So this is a picture based on work that was initially done at MIT, which tries to capture the impact of digital technologies' automation effect. Right? So what these folks did is they basically took the entire panoply of employment in the United States and divided it two ways. They divided it into what they call cognitive, non-cognitive, which you should think of as white and blue collar. It's easier to remember. And they divided it into routine and non-routine. Now, what does routine mean? It specifically means that there's a specific set of rules that describe how this task gets done. We know what those rules are. We can code those rules, and a machine can do it. So it's automation of a certain form. Now, some of you will think robots, but I think probably the white-collar automation has been as important, if not more important, in our economies. And what you see is that non-routine jobs grew. Not at exactly the same pace, but have steadily grown. But the routine jobs drifted down over an extended period of time, and then around the year 2000, they started to fall very, very rapidly. It's not a steady fall. Point one, routine jobs are being stripped out of modern economies. Now, what I just showed you for the United States is not unique to the United States. In addition to all that, that's based on what you might call old technology. So let me devote a few words to some, and if I get this wrong, there are probably people in the room who are experts on this. But there has been a breakthrough in artificial intelligence. So the old model was what I just described in terms of codifiability. And the problem with that model is it had severe limits because there's quite a wide range of things that we think it might be possible for machines to do, which have the property that we know how to do them, but we don't know how to describe how we do them with any precision, which means we can't code them. And I remember John Seeley Brown telling me a couple of years ago that back 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, he thought artificial intelligence had hit a dead end because a computer couldn't do a simple thing like recognize a chair. It didn't do translation very well. It couldn't listen to spoken languages. When you think about it, I mean, you know, my kids are trilingual. They speak English because of me, Italian because of Juliana, and German because there's a German school next door. And when they hear, and they speak English like I speak English, if you allow me that. And they can listen to an English spoken with a very heavy accent, say a heavy English accent, like a Cockney accent, and they know exactly what they're hearing. They have no idea why. An older person who learned English at a later stage wouldn't be able to hear that, right? They'd say, what my wife says to me all the time, listening to American movies with Southern accents like many of yours. She says, what are they saying, right? We have no idea how we do that. But it certainly isn't by following a set of rules, right? So translation, image recognition, all that stuff seem to be sort of beyond our ken. And then scientists and engineers invented a completely different model that I describe as learnable as opposed to codifiable. And I won't attempt to describe it, but basically they're statistical models, sometimes called neural networks, that allow, and image recognition capabilities, pattern recognition capabilities that allow machines to learn. And the relevance of that, and then I'll stop on this, is that the scope of things that are automatable just jumped a huge amount. So if we think we've seen a lot of automation and labor disintermediation in our economies, I think we've only seen the start rather than the end. So this is a trend that will go on. The next thing is pretty simple, and this has more to do with globalization, I think, and less to do with digital technologies. But the United States has experienced a steady decline in manufacturing jobs to a total of about 6 million, depending on how far back you go. And there's the same inflection point around the year 2000. That is a dramatic acceleration in the speed with which these jobs disappeared. Now, just for light entertainment, I'm going to show you a video. Some of you have seen this, and I hope it works. So what you're about to see is an Amazon distribution center. It's not high-tech in terms of digital technology. It basically has robots and a big, fancy computer information system that knows where all these products are. They're in those boxes. Millions and millions of SKUs. And then it's connected to the sellers who are told when to replenish the stocks and all that sort of thing. So it all works kind of seamlessly. And then this operation is capable of shipping it. These robots were built by a company that Amazon bought. They're called Kiva robots. They don't bump into each other. They don't bump into people. And they do what the computers tell them. And what happens is when an order comes in, the computer systems know where that item is. And one of these robots gets told to go get it, presumably one that's fairly nearby. And it picks up the whole stack. And it takes it to a station where a person is told which box it's in, and then that individual, which you will see in a minute, it's called picking and packing. They pick the item out of the box, scan it with a barcode, and off it goes to a system that essentially packs it and ships it. And this is the person. Now, this is not the only person in this distribution center, but it's close. You do have to maintain these machines. This whole process 20 years ago would have required hundreds and hundreds of people. This thing will ship 25 parcels a second, maybe 25 million a day on a big day, like Black Monday or Friday or whatever. I don't need to go on about this, but this is not fancy technology. And this happens to be physical distribution. It's not manufacturing, so it's not robotics making things. And it's not all those information systems that are disintermediating labor. So this is changing the demand side of the labor market very fast in all developed economies, and faster in America because we tend to do these things first. This one, I apologize, is advertising, but this is robots. And we've had robots for a long time. And there's a Japanese company that makes these things. And all I want you to see is that there's been a breakthrough in robotics. In addition to the machine learning capabilities that I described before, robots have two things that they didn't have up until fairly recently. One is sensors, so they can see and, if necessary, hear. And the second thing is fine motor coordination. So if you said 15 years ago that you can assemble electronics products with a robot, people would have laughed. Robots put rivets in cars, all right? And if there isn't a car there, they'll rivet whatever it is anyway, because they don't have any awareness of what's going on around them. And now you can assemble electronics. You can assemble electric razors, things that require considerable human skill to do. And what this robot is doing is picking up colored objects which it can see, dumps them on a thing. I mean, this is pretty trivial, but it's the same technology that allows automation of an increasing range of production processes. So if you go, as a friend of mine did, to Shanghai and go to the customs people and say, what are we importing here in China? You'll get a very simple answer. It's robots. Thousands and thousands of robots. And all that electronics assembly, that's been done manually, very labor-intensive process is going to shift. It may not leave China. In fact, it may move to, once you have robotics, notice this isn't, then you don't move to where labor is, because labor is the most immobile of the factors of production. You move toward the market. So this is another aspect of the breakthrough. So I'm going to stop that now. And this is three-dimensional printing or additive manufacturing. Probably some of this technology has been developed right here at Rice. This is an inkjet printer that prints in 3 dimensions, and it can print plastics or titanium or a whole bunch of other things. So it's a very interesting, customizable technology, and it operates off databases that describe the object that you want. So what happens is you basically create design on a computer, the object that you want. It could be a spare part, it could be part of an airplane wing, it could be almost anything, a lamp. And then the database is sent to a 3D printer, which absorbs it and then prints it. It takes some time. So it's entirely customizable. It's on demand, right? If you think about, for those of you who live in the world of global supply chains, you make a forecast. You guess how many blue shirts and check shirts and dresses you're going to need. And that's a forecast, and then the whole supply chain kicks in behind that. This is production to actual demand. Right? There's no guesswork in this, right? Somebody says, I want this, and you print it. That's a building, a model of a building, a prototype, and that's an athletic shoe, which they can now print with these things. So it's another technology that is digitally based that is important. This is a Philips electronic assembly operation, entirely robotic. It's in the Netherlands. And at the time this was taken, which is probably about 3 years ago, it had approximately the same cost characteristics of the plant, a labor-intensive plant outside of Shanghai, which means that now it'll be more efficient. And there's no turning back, okay? Once the digital technology passes some alternative, a labor-intensive one or so on, that's it. You'll never revert. Why? Because most of the costs are fixed. It's the development of the technology. The software is a fixed cost. It's replicable at zero cost, essentially. So and this is kind of everywhere. I asked a friend of mine in the athletic shoe industry recently, I said, you're sort of doing robotics, right? And this individual said, yeah, we are. We don't talk about it very much for competitive reasons, but we are. This is a different lens. This is work that I did with a co-author, South African. So we looked at the American economy. This is the nerdiest thing I think I will say. So an economy consists of a bunch of sectors that produce goods and services, and some of those goods and services trade internationally, and some of them don't. So we call the part that trades internationally tradable. Seems logical, doesn't it? And the other part non-tradable. The non-tradable part of an economy is huge. It's government, healthcare, construction, hotels, foods, restaurants, education. If you actually go look at economies about, a modern economy in North America or Europe, it's about 2/3 non-tradable. And then there's another part, which is the part that directly interacts with the global economy, which produces goods. The manufacturing sectors are mostly tradable, and then slightly less visibly, a bunch of services. Very high-end, high-value-added services, like consulting, like managing multinational enterprises, like designing things, iPhones and computers. A lot of things that are pretty important in this economy, those are tradable. And so we divided the American economy up sector by sector into these two categories, and then asked ourselves the following question: where did we generate growth as conventionally measured by value added? Why value added? Because it adds up to the GDP. And where do we generate employment? And we were startled to discover that in the 2 decades up to through the crisis, the employment generation in the United States was entirely on the non-tradable side. And what happened on the tradable side is we lost manufacturing jobs and made up almost exact same number on the services side, so they netted out to zero. Now, to a first approximation, and without pretending that this is sort of rigorous analysis, you can see what's going on here. There's two big, powerful forces operating on the economy. One are global market forces, and the other one are technological forces. The first set, the technological ones, have lots of positive effects that we'll experience in the long run, but the immediate impact on labor markets is to take routine, mostly middle-class jobs out of the system. And the effect of globalization is similar on that third of the economy. What thrived is the high value-added service creation stuff. And by the way, the people who live in that world, including everybody in this room, is just thrilled by globalization and the opportunities it creates. I mean, it's been a bonanza. The problem is that in the middle to low middle income range, the effect has been somewhat different. Not necessarily permanently negative, but creating a big imbalance between the human capital and skill set that the labor force has and what the market is demanding, because the demand side moved so fast. And so because the American economy is pretty flexible and dynamic compared to many economies, very flexible and dynamic, these markets sort of clear. And what happened to the people, the middle income range in America that got shunted out of the tradable side and to some extent shunted out of jobs on the technology side, ended up a subset probably gravitating to the upper end of the distribution, but a very substantial majority going into the lower end, non-routine service sector. They got jobs. I mean, with this amount of job destruction, you might have thought we would have an employment problem. Well, we do in lots of economies, say in Europe, partly for this reason. But the American economy absorbs this, but that doesn't really necessarily solve the problem from people's point of view. So if you take several million people who were formerly employed here and put them here, competing for the jobs, at the very least, labor loses its bargaining power. and the income start to stagnate at that part of the distribution. And if you look at the American income distribution, it shows exactly this effect, right? That is fairly rapid growth in the upper quartile and fairly steady, stagnant situation at the other part. This is just the flip side of the coin. So if you look at value added, meaning growth, in these two parts of the economy, you have a completely different picture, right? So the tradable part grew. Let me give an example. Apple grew quite a lot, right? They make a product, so they're in the tradable side of the economy. But they didn't make anything here, right? All of the value added that appears in the American accounts that's attributable to Apple is the value they create here in design, brand, marketing, retail, all the things that they do that generate a huge amount of value here. The things are made elsewhere. And so if you look at value added per person employed, you get this. This is just literally a logical consequence of what I just showed you. What you see is the tradable sector became higher and higher value added in terms of the people and the value created in those activities. And the non-tradable sector, which absorbed all the employment, had similar growth pattern, but we used it all up, employing the people, basically. And so we have a problem with employment opportunities and income distribution that are tradable. Finally, this has given rise to what is sometimes called job and income polarization, and it's real. And it means something very simple, which is these forces combined, however you choose to sort of see them and look at them, have produced an empirically verifiable pattern of declines in middle income jobs, specific jobs, and declines in middle incomes and increases at the end. If this became extreme, and it hasn't, we would have bimodal distributions. That is, that look like this. Right now we have something that used to look like this, and now it's kind of a lot flatter because the tails got bigger. This issue, this phenomenon, is not unique to the United States. So skipping ahead, this is a picture for a variety of European countries of exactly what I just said. That is, the pink bars are the middle-paying jobs, the high-paying jobs are the black bars, and the low-paying jobs are the green bars. Now, if you're going to have this pattern, you want the black bars to be as big as possible, right? And the green bars to be as small as possible. And it varies considerably from country to country. So if you look there at Italy, Antonio, you have a bigger green bar than you would ideally like to see in a lower black bar. And you can learn a lot about what's going on in Europe if you have a kind of background in it. So generally, the economies in Europe, subject to the same market forces, with different policies that mitigate some of the distributional effects, mostly more successfully, but with some cost in terms of flexibility in the economy. The successful economies tend to be in the north. Some of them are small economies. They're kind of used to being buffeted around by the global economy. They're structurally flexible. And in the south, we have economies that have struggled with change that's this rapid. They don't have the structural flexibility that we have in America. And then you have this giant, Germany, right in the middle. And Germany used to be exactly like the South. The economists called Germany the sick man of Europe. It wasn't very polite, but it was true, in the year 2000 on the cover. And the Germans decided to do something about it. Chancellor Schroeder, with whom I once spoke about this, said, you know what, it was true. We had social security systems that consisted of protecting your specific job, your specific plant, your specific company, your specific town, and that is not structural flexibility. That is growth killing, a way to deliver social protection to people in a highly volatile world. And they shifted the whole thing around. The reason for doing it is after a kind of lost decade, after the end of the Cold War, Eastern Europe came online, and the Germans knew that some of that manufacturing, it's a manufacturing powerhouse, by the way, but they knew some of it had to go to Eastern Europe, and that it was better to do it themselves rather than having it done to you. That's also a general principle, by the way. Competition is really important in terms of innovation. And so they set about to try to agree with labor. Now, Germany has an interesting structure. Labor sits on the management boards of all major companies. And so they had an institutional setup in which they could have a very difficult, I might add, conversation that involved government, labor, and business, the conclusion of which is these structures that we've lived with and thrived with for so long aren't going to work anymore. Labor had to be convinced. A friend of mine in a major German company said, labor just didn't believe us when the management told them. So we said, this was their solution to this problem. They gave them a massive budget, and the labor unions, and said, hire 6 consultants and ask every of them independently to tell you whether what we just said is true. The global supply chains are going to shift this stuff out of Germany, and they did, and the labor came back and said, you know what, you were right, we better actually tackle this problem. The result is that Germany went from the sick man of Europe to hyper-competitive in Europe. And this was the era of the euro, and the other economies didn't go through this process. So as you will see in a minute, the differentials in terms of competitiveness as measured by unit labor costs in relation to productivity, these divergences just ballooned. And now we have a situation in which Portugal, Italy, Spain to a slightly lesser extent, basically can't grow on the tradable side because they're 25% out of bounds vis-a-vis the German standard, which they created in the period 2003 to 2006. This I will not this comes from the McKinsey Global Institute, but I find it striking. We normally focus on flows of goods and services and flows of capital, both of which are pretty mobile in the world that America was the architect of after World War II. And most of this growth, both in developed and developing countries, was because the architecture was essentially right. Labor is not so mobile, which is why global supply chains until recently have been organized around going to find valuable pools of labor and increasingly efficiently integrating them into complex global supply chains. But the other really important flow is data, information, knowledge. And this is just growing like a weed. And I would say, without being able to prove it to you today, if you want an index of whether an economy is positioned to succeed in the world in the next decade or two, you could do worse than go and look at how well connected it is and what the data flows are to various parts of the global economy. So if you look on the left-hand side here, there's only 3 big, moderately big, medium-sized data flows in the year 2005. 2005, I mean 12 years ago. And they are North America to Latin America, and North America to Europe, and North America to Asia, or vice versa. I didn't mean to put North America first. And now, you just fast forward 9 years, and these pipes are enormous, right? And they're connecting everybody. And anybody that still has dotted lines, if there are any, is out of it, literally out of it. So this element, it's not everything there is to do with connectivity, but it's really, it's an element of infrastructure that's absolutely critical. This is very hard to measure, but I'll just show it to you. So these challenges that I'm describing to you, which are essentially some combination of growth and employment generation and distribution, are a function of the last 30 years. So if you look at the growth patterns in the early post-war period, growth was high. The developing countries joined the party. Global income inequality started to decline because they were poor and started to get richer, and they were growing faster than we were. China, as I think you know, once it started to grow properly in around 1980, its growth rate is approximately 10% a year. You can get whiplash growing at these speeds. An economy growing at 10% a year doubles every 7 years in size. And you can actually almost see it happening before your eyes. And of course, it's a chaotic process. But the fraction of income going to people who work for the first 30 years after World War II as a fraction of total income rose. And the pattern reversed in the late 1970s. I don't think anybody pretends to completely understand all the forces, but essentially the labor share of income has been declining. And since governments probably haven't changed their share very much. I mean, it's either got to go to labor, the owners of capital, or the government. and so this probably means that the share of capital has been increasing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a reflection of the same forces that we just saw. Okay, this is speculative, so anybody who believes that you ought to pay attention to causality is probably going to shoot me right now. So think of this as a pure correlation, right? I mean, similarity. So a friend of ours, a friend of mine, Dave Brady, also taught here at Rice, has been involved in sort of studying American politics and so on, and somebody put together a picture that has two items on it. One is the American income distribution, the so-called Gini coefficient, which has been rising and is consistent with everything I told you up till now, and a measure of polarization in the House of Representatives. Now you might say, what's that measure? It's approximately, if you draw a Venn diagram of, the positions on various issues of the Republicans and Democrats. In the old days, they overlapped a fair amount. And over time, they overlap a little bit less. And now they're close to not overlapping very much at all. I don't know if it's a good measure or not. But what's interesting, and at least I think thought-provoking, is that, and I'm going to conclude with this, is that trends like the ones I've described, if left unattended, produce a political response. And if you look at Latin America carefully, which has the highest measured income and wealth inequality in the world by a lot, for historical reasons. There was no redistribution of land and other forms of wealth. And if you know anything about politics in Latin America, unlike Asia, they tend to swing back and forth like a pendulum from populism, to something pretty market fundamentalist sounding. And that has problems distributionally, so it swings back to populism, which produces very little growth, and back and forth. Now, it's getting better, to be honest with you. So there's not a permanent condition, and there's important leaders who have broken out of this pattern. But it maybe isn't surprising that the place that has historically the worst problem with this swinging back and forth and occasional outburst of populism is the place with the highest measured income inequality. And now I'll probably say something outrageous, and then we can have a question period. But my view of these growth patterns is that they were problematic from a distributional point of view. They're challenging to deal with, but the real problem was that in most places, they were not responded to at all. So what is a challenge that people, in one scenario, you might think, well, we've all got this challenge sorted together. Our kids might be in another part of the income distribution. We're going to do something about it. And we can have huge debates about what to do about it. Because I don't think it's obvious. And realistic differences of opinion. But ignoring it, I think, produces a political backlash. So what I think you're seeing is what I call political circuit breakers. They have slightly different origins depending on where you are. But the two that have fired so far are Brexit, which has what you just saw in a British form combined with a sovereignty issue. So there's another powerful force that's running loose in the developed part world in the global economy, which is a sense that we don't control our own destiny anymore. In the Eurozone, that's particularly powerful because there's so many constraints. But in Britain, there were people who work in the City of London who are in the upper end of the distribution I just described, who voted for Brexit. And when asked why, you weren't suffering, like the Midlands. the hollowed out manufacturing sector, they said because we don't control our own destiny, i.e. the sovereignty issue. And that's pretty powerful in much of Europe. And there is, again, I mean, social scientists will need to study this, but there is something disorienting and anxiety creating about being controlled not only by forces that are powerful, but ones that not even your elected representatives can control, which gives you a sense of being out there. Then we had the Trump phenomenon. Somebody was going to walk through the door and get elected substantially on appealing to the people who felt that they hadn't been the primary beneficiaries of the growth patterns we were in. And I didn't know who, nobody knew who it was going to be. He did it pretty effectively. And to be honest, if I characterize the Trump administration right now as having two characteristics. One, uncertain in terms of outcomes, and two, the signal to noise ratio is very low. But the economic policies, even if, depending on where you land, if they would stop the Twitter storms and whatnot and focus on 3 or 4 items in the economic policies with pretty sensible people involved, you can actually get a pretty big change in the growth patterns in America. The challenge of meeting the expectations of the people who elected him, whose experiences I've tried to give you a glimpse of in this talk, is a challenge. Protectionism is not going to get it done. Getting companies to think a little more carefully before they make investment decisions, on the international front, might help. I mean, there are differences in countries. When a German multinational decides to invest somewhere, they think carefully about whether or not they need to move it out of Germany. They may do it, for sure, because it just makes economic sense. But they'll think about it probably a little more carefully than some of our companies have in the past. And they may be trying to change the culture by sort of rattling the saber and threatening them a bit. So now I think it brings us up to the present. So the question is, now we're in Europe. And I guess I can show you quickly the problems in Europe. Sorry, I'll just flick ahead. So this is the unit labor costs taken from Eurostat. Eurostat is like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the BEA in the United States. And basically what this is unit labor costs in relation to productivity indexed to 2000, with everybody indexed to 2000 at 100. And what you can see is that everybody went sailing north of Germany by a lot. Okay, now that might not make a difference, if you were Canada or the United States or Mexico, because we all have our own exchange rates, and they fluctuate a lot. So in Italy, what would have happened in the old days is we would have had another devaluation of the lira, and we would be fine. We would be poorer because we're not as productive, but we would be fine. Now we're stuck because we have an exchange rate that is some kind of weighted average of the productivity of the members of this common currency area, and we're not able to generate growth on the tradable side of the economy. Now, that's not the only problem. We also have a large sovereign debt overhang of 135% debt to GDP. And the normal way you get rid of a sovereign debt overhang is with nominal growth. Our inflation rate is close to 0, and our growth is 0. Imagine this just for a moment. You live in a country that, while growth has been, by some standards, subpar, for the last 10 years, and there are challenges, including especially the declining productivity challenge. Italy is a country whose GDP is exactly the same it was in the year 2000. That's 17 years with no growth, 0. Now, it went up a little bit, and it came back down in the course of, that history. The unemployment rate is 12%. The youth unemployment rate is 45%. That means your kids and grandkids have a 1 in 2 chance, almost, of getting a job. Worse if they're high school grads. Much better if they're college or advanced degree holders. But on average, So you asked yourself, so here's people ask me this all the time. Antonio, I do invite you to step in at this point. Europeans are very dedicated to the European project. Their problem is not as significantly the distributional one I just described, the one we have here. Their problem is there isn't enough growth. Europe has done a better job on average of mitigating these forces, some in the right way. That is, without mucking up the economic dynamism of their economy. But at least in a significant number of these countries, there are real problems with the growth patterns in terms of level and employment generation. So it's different. So people then come along and say, well, what's going to happen? And what some Europeans say, including people who are, have been important players in creating this rather impressive edifice over 40, 50, 60 years since the Treaty of Rome, is our dedication to this is so important because it's really about peace. It's about not having 2 more world wars, that we don't need to be proud of the way this thing is performing economically, but we're not abandoning it almost no matter what. And that may be right. My view is that if you have a system that doesn't work to this extent, people will put up with it for an astonishingly long time, but not forever. And so what I think you are seeing is the beginning of the not forever, the rise of populist parties, most of whom are nationalist, anti-Euro, for sure. And we don't know when that political circuit breaker will go off, or whether it will go off. But I'm not sanguine. So my description of Europe is either there's a fairly substantial change in direction, which means policy at the national level and the EU level, that generates a much better, over time, not overnight, but over time, a much better set of growth outcomes and patterns. Or at some point, one of these nationalist parties is going to win and then start to dismantle the operation. I hope it's the former rather than the latter. A world with a healthy United States, which we have, and a healthy Asia, which we have. I haven't had a chance to talk about China and Asia, and thank God for you. You don't want to be here all afternoon. But we'd benefit enormously from having a Europe that's an integrated entity and a powerful kind of voice. But not just in economic policy, but in human terms and other things. And we don't have it now. What we've got is a Europe that's distracted and fragmented and sort of a slow motion train wreck. And I hope that changes. Thank you very much.
That for questions, we have a microphone that we can pass around, so it's going to be hard for people to move if they want to ask questions. But we have about 20 minutes, and if anybody has any question for Professor Spence, yeah, we can pass the mic.
You can talk about something else too.
So what might be the path forward for Europe? So is Merkel right that it needs more unity, and if so, what would be the policies that would further that unity and allow this union, which seems so fragile, to be a success?
Yeah, so it's a very, very good question. Let me try and be brief. First, you need more integration. Because right now you have a common currency with essentially everybody's on their own, in other respects, until there's a crisis and then they're bailed out, which is the Greek situation. And that doesn't work, take Germany. In the 1990s, Germany unified East and West. The East was a basket case. I mean, it had productivity levels that weren't even within shooting distance of the West, right? They integrated at the exchange rate of the West, which meant that the other folks weren't even competitive. Why did it work? They were completely committed to it. They thought they were all Germans. Labor was mobile, and they spoke the same language. And the West invested an enormous amount in the East in bringing it over time, bringing it up to speed. And to the extent that didn't work, the East folks went to the West. All right? Now look at Europe, right? German citizens don't believe that we should do that in Europe. If Italians get into trouble, it's up to the Italians to fix it. There's no, big, we're going to put this thing back together. I'm not being critical of Germans, but this is just a fact of life. It's as if Texas is doing fine and New Mexico, your neighbor over here, gets into trouble, and then Texans say, we don't want any money crossing the border. Okay? That never happens here, right? In fact, you don't even know whether some of your money went to New Mexico because it's all sort of sitting there in a big mishmash, in the federal budget. And when somebody gets into trouble, it doesn't matter where they are, right? So that's part of it. And the real problem, to be honest with you, is that sentiment is running the opposite direction. I mean, the populists say, okay, if we're on our own, we're on our own, but then we're getting out of here. And so the notion that we're going to go in that direction is something you could justifiably be skeptical about. We may need also to back off on the common currency. So it's very difficult to do. But to be honest with you, we'd be in much better shape if we had 2 euros, one for the North and one for the South, because it would produce an instantaneous adjustment. Now, whether we'll ever get there, this is a proposal Joe Stiglitz has made. There are other versions of it. The Germans should leave. So the Germans can have their own currency, with low inflation and everything else. But it's pretty stacked against us. So this competitiveness problem, if you don't have an exchange rate, you have to have an internal deflation, which means basically your costs have to go up a lot slower than Germany's, right? But Germans don't like inflation, right? And inflation has been way below the 2%, about a little bit below target of the ECB. And so it takes forever to deflate your way back into a competitive position. And beyond that, the other thing, which I think is not the structure in the euro, is it's very difficult to undertake the structural reforms that these various economies need. The best performer among the economies that need it has been Spain. Spain has done some really difficult things, and it shows in the growth. If you go look at the growth numbers for Spain, you'll see 3.5%. Now, you might say, well, they're fine. Actually, they're quite a long way from being out of the woods, but 3.5 is a heck of a lot better than 0.4 or whatever we're at in Italy. So there's some serious work to be done by politicians and policymakers within countries that really need these reforms. And countries vary in whether they can kind of get that done. Do you want to add anything on Italy? Good. Other than that, it's kind of simple. Yes, go ahead. We'll get to
Trump has been talking about getting manufacturing jobs back into the country. So two-part question, how realistic is it? And secondly, is it conceivable that we might have a tremendous robotics revolution, a second one or a third one, which will probably replace the possibility of bringing all these jobs back?
Yeah. So I think you kind of hit the high points. The digital technologies will bring some parts of manufacturing back because they'll come toward the market, and we have a big market. It won't all come back. Secondly, when people say it'll never happen, they're thinking of the labor-intensive stuff to the extent it isn't knocked out by the digitally capital-intensive technology. That'll never happen. There's still Bangladesh and a bunch of other. It doesn't. If you went to business people and said, we're going to do that, they'd say you're nuts. And even consumers wouldn't accept it. So that's not going to happen. But you can imagine at the margin the recovery of some very high value-added manufacturing, which we already have, by the way. It's just we want a little bit more. And to some extent, that means upgrading the labor force that's able to do that. The model that Chinese use is the German companies in the auto industry around Stuttgart. They are small and medium-sized, sometimes family-owned. They are just startlingly innovative. And they are global. Partly because they get to sit on the coattails of the global companies that run the global supply chains, the Mercedes and VWs and Audis and BMW, et cetera. So So I think it's sort of, the one thing I think I would say by way of summary on this is manufacturing may come back, but we are in an evolution at a pace that we don't yet really know, in which our economies become service economies. And we have to have a workforce that's prepared to thrive in those things. The way McAfee and Brynjolfsson describe it, these are the MIT guys that wrote the Second Machine Age. This is just a very good book that sort of exposes the technologies that are kind of pushing us around. It said the jobs that are interesting are the ones that are complementary to the machines, not the ones that are substitutes for the machines. And I think it's basically, I mean, as a mental orientation, it's right. So yeah, we can bring some of it back. It'll be very high tech. It'll be probably digitally enabled. But there's an important part of these industries. Remember, I didn't say this very much because I didn't want to talk about global supply chains. But if you look at a manufacturing supply chain, it varies from industry to industry. But it is not uncommon to find that well over 50% of the value added is in services. I mean, they're complicated things. I mean, it's way more than that in electronics products like Apple. It's probably 70%. Within the 30% is assembly and the components that don't get made here for the most part yet. We can thrive in the 70% in a kind of globalized world, and it'll look in the statistics like we have a manufacturing industry. We still may not be making it here. But anyway, hopefully that's somewhat responsive. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to
Oh, sorry, you didn't have the mic. Okay. Well, I apologize.
going back to government policy, can you discuss some of the commonalities on government policy regarding education for those countries that have experienced the greatest amount of growth in the past 2 decades?
Yeah. So almost everybody agree. So let me start this way. So we've looked around the world and asked which countries are doing pretty well in thriving in this globalized world and protecting people from the shocks that get delivered to us and shifting the workforce in such a way that they find opportunities even as the demand side of the labor market moves. And the answer that we normally come up with is the Nordic countries. They have done the best job of doing this. They're open economies because they have to be, right? In America, we can pretend we have this huge market, so we can make most stuff if we want. If you have in a country of 12 million people, and somebody comes, Sweden, and somebody comes along and says, well, we can have a very diversified manufacturing sector, we'll make most of this stuff. It's rubbish, right? We're nowhere near the scale. So these economies are highly specialized, which means that they are vulnerable to global shocks, and they have learned to buffer their citizens from these global shocks. And what they've learned recently is to make those buffering mechanisms oriented toward job retraining so people get back in the workforce. Now, there's some of that in Germany as well, but I think there's some best practice. I guess the only other thing I would say is in an astonishingly wide range of countries are experiencing either high variance or negative trends in various parts of education. And that's exactly what you don't want to have if you want to have people who are as well prepared as they can be. The last thing I'll say is this isn't just public spending and public investment. I mean, people and families invest in their ability to thrive. And one of the problems with a highly skewed income distribution is people at the bottom end of the distribution don't have the resources to make that investment, right? And if they don't have the resources to make it, then that's a vicious cycle. So people differ a lot on this among each other and across the political spectrum. But my way of thinking, and I've seen this in developing as well as developed countries, is you can live with a fair amount of ex-post income inequality, and people will live with it. You know, partly because that's what markets do, and partly because it's what people choose. You know, there's a lot of people in this room that are richer than I am, because I chose to be an academic. I've never regretted that choice, but I don't get paid the same way as if I managed assets successfully or did a bunch of other things. Anyway, but there are limits to that, okay? And if you go beyond those limits, then you start to get negative results. People abandon the public education system because they can, and then the forces that operate to make it better get weakened, and you get various dysfunctional negative spirals running. I don't know whether we're there, but I would, in my judgment, we're, at least in some communities, close. The controversial part, so what most people say is, yes, deal with the income distribution, the ability to invest. Yes, deal with the supply side, which is essentially human capital. It's your ability to participate in an economy. Way more controversial is mucking around with the demand side. What would that mean? Well, you're starting to see a discussion of it. So in developing countries, they control, to some extent, the impact of the global economy on their own economy. They know that openness is a good thing and they benefit enormously. But openness doesn't mean completely open tomorrow morning, okay? India has the world's most fragmented retail system in the world by orders of magnitude. I mean, these are people with inventories that add up to $30 who are selling them out of carts. Now, very smart people from Washington or Brussels come along and say, you ought to open this up. If, Carrefour and Walmart get in there, it'll be way more efficient. And the Indians say, yeah, but we'll have 100 million people out of work. So the answer is yes, so sort of, sometime in the future, right? This is just straight pragmatism. There's nothing ideological about this. Is the actual implementation of a growth strategy, at least in a developing country, means being sensible about how fast your economy can adjust structurally and generate new kinds of employment, and how much you need to control the way and the speed and the power of the forces operating on it, whether it's products, services, or capital markets. And I think we're just starting to get the hang of that in the developed countries. So you will see Trump say, I'm going to renegotiate some of these agreements. What he means is, I'm going to renegotiate them so that the benefits aren't one-sided. You're a grown-up, I'm a grown-up, and I'll renegotiate these things so it's mutually beneficial. And if there are a few more barriers in the middle, so be it, right? That's what we're supposed to do. There are downsides to that approach, but including the multilateralism disappearing. And recently, there's been a proposed tax on robots, which was initially laughed at. But Bill Gates and a number of other people said, well, why don't we discuss it rather than laugh? That would be, in a kind of funny way, a way of affecting the pace with which this set of technologies arrive. Now, whether it's a good idea or not, is a different question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a question about the consequences. In discussing the European Union and its possible decline, today one of the financial newsletters I take said, when Europe goes down and breaks apart, then it will affect Japan most immediately because they sell so much to Europe. And then, meanwhile, money will pour into the United States looking for a safe haven so that we'll go up in, say, our stock market. This, who knows how many years this is, but that then it will lead to war because Japan will be weakened, China will take the islands and other properties. So would you comment on what you think the consequences?
Okay. There's simpler ways to go to war. So the part of that I think I probably don't agree with is I don't think Japan is particularly extraordinarily vulnerable to Europe relative to other places. So China's and all of Asia is vulnerable to Europe. We, frankly, are vulnerable to Europe. Europe is a very important trading partner of ours. And so a collapse there would produce a generalized pattern of damage. But I don't think, I mean, that's an interesting argument, but I think it probably isn't the primary reason why we should hope that Europe pulls through this period of difficulty. The tensions in Asia are real, and some of those tensions are with us as well, to the extent we decide we're going to stay engaged in Europe, and that's kind of a sort of open question. I mean, I actually think we will. I mean, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric that's gone around, are pretty clear that walking out of Asia and our agreements in security terms with countries in Asia it was not a smart move. So there's some nervousness in Asia. However, they really don't know what we're going to do. And if we do walk out, China will be absolutely the dominant force, and it already is economically, to be honest with you. Anyway, I wouldn't worry about that too much.
What do you put the odds that Europe will stay together?
50-50.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Sorry, what? Yes, sir.
So on that optimistic note, I want to ask a question about politics, which I know is a little bit unfair to ask an economist that. But these countries that you're talking about, the United States, the various democracies in Europe, we all have very different political institutions, right?
Right.
So you have, central versus federalized systems. You have presidential versus parliamentary systems. You have different electoral systems.
Yep.
And we're thinking about China. They would even have democratic and non-democratic systems.
Yep.
And so with these adjustments, I mean, are there any sorts of electoral structures or political structures that you have found have negotiated these waters particularly well, and you predict might in the future? And conversely, are there any sorts of systemic configurations that you think are not going to do too well? Thanks.
It's a very good question, and it's an important one. I think I have a few thoughts on the matter, and I'm happy to share a couple of them. But I think this is an area in which we don't know anywhere near enough. That is, this is an area where a young generation of researchers is going to move the ball down the field a lot. My observation, for what it's worth, is coming from the developing country experience, and I think Malcolm would have agreed with this, is it is not the form of government that matters too much. It's the behavior and intent of the leadership group. So by far the most important cause of poor economic performance and worse is a government that doesn't really care in one way or another about the well-being and advancement of the people. It may be stowing, funds away in Zurich. It may be trying to stay in power by buying votes. There's lots of ways to distort a democracy. And most of those ways you can observe in lower income countries. There's a fair amount of research on this. Paul Collier did a study and found that most of the failing democracies were in countries with per capita incomes below $3,000. So, but what I tell the students in my class, at least about this, is, look, if you construct a McKinsey-style 2x2 matrix with autocratic and democratic on one axis and poor and stellar economic performance on the other axis, you got 4 boxes. It's easy to fill them all in. Which I mean, and so if you can fill them all in, it means the form is not decisive, right? And I think we agree that autocratic systems are more dangerous. That is, if they're poorly motivated, in the sense I meant just a few minutes ago, you can get terrible results and there's no corrective mechanism. If you want safety, you probably want democracy, as Marty says. At the other end of the spectrum, a well-motivated autocratic system has some advantages in terms of aggressiveness, speed of movement, and so on. Singapore and China. And so it's a kind of judgment call whether you want to take the risk. But I don't think, based on that set of experiences, that there's a structural fix to polarization and gridlock. I came away with the feeling that what really matters is effective leadership. When people get split apart somehow, you got to bring them back together around a vision that's feasible. So there are no guarantees you get excellent leadership, but I think if you don't have it, it's very hard to solve a lot of these problems, including these.
One last question.
If jobs are disappearing due to the factors that you described, do we need to consider a potential future where there's the linkage between employment and money is broken in some way or weakened?
Yeah, we may get there. I mean, this is what causes people to talk about, a kind of guaranteed income, and you can imagine a world in which people take a lot more leisure, but in which the normal way, market mechanisms for allocating income modified by social programs and tax systems really don't work anymore. But so let me say something general in response to that. There's a lot of things that are debated now because people can glimpse possible futures where you can't finish the debate because we can't know. So the technology debates have the same thing. In the long run, is technology, this set of technologies, whatever they are in 20 or 30 years, are they going to be beneficial? And my answer to that is, yeah, probably, but we can't know, right? And we can't know what changes we're going to go through. So it's more productive to discuss navigating, over the decades that we have to navigate so that people benefit as best we can. We know it's a tough transition. We've seen it before, rather than the debate. So my answer is, yes, we could get there, but it's better to focus on getting there in an orderly fashion and on the journey rather than the end point, I think, is where I come out.
Okay, let's thanks once again.
Thank you.